Hi there, in this video I'm going to compare the Nikon D850 to the Nikon Z6 Mark II. So I purchased the Nikon Z6 Mark II about a month ago now, so I've really had time to get used to it and compare the difference between this and the Nikon D850. What we're going to do in this video is I'm going to compare the specs of the two cameras, and then at the end I'll give you an overview of whether I think it was worth upgrading to a mirrorless camera system. What I will say at the outset is having a new camera is always good for helping you to enjoy your photography. I have made another video where I talked about my reasons for going mirrorless, and if you haven't already watched that, I'll link it up here. But this video is more going to be about comparing the two cameras. Normally a comparison video would compare the D850 to a Z7 Mark II, which has a much more comparable sensor size. But I had the Z6 Mark II for reasons that I talked about in my previous video, but I still think it stacks up very well against this camera. Now, in my opinion, both of these cameras are great at taking stills, and the Nikon D850 perhaps is one of the greatest DSLRs that has been made. So you definitely couldn't go wrong with that. But the technology that's been put into the new mirrorless cameras has started to really catch up, and the gap between them has narrowed to an extent that the mirrorless cameras have started to overtake. So let's start to get into the specs, which is what this video is really about. So I'm going to put these up on the screen so you can pause them and have a look at them and compare the two. First of all, let's have a look at the sensor that's inside these two cameras. So in the Nikon D850 we have a full frame 45.7 megapixel sensor, and in the Z6 Mark II the sensor is a 24.5 megapixel full frame sensor. So you can see that the D850 records many more megapixels than the Z6 Mark II, but it's only any use if you actually use those megapixels. They do create larger file sizes and are only really going to be any use if you're cropping in an awful lot and still want to retain detail, or are going to blow the pictures up really large. Let's have a think about the processors. Inside the D850 there's an X-Speed 5 processor, whereas the Z6 Mark II has dual processors, which helps with the autofocus. One of the biggest differences between the two cameras is that Nikon has introduced a new lens mount for the mirrorless cameras called the Z mount. Now, with the DSLRs, there is an F mount that has been used for decades. So people that have had this kind of system will have lots of lenses that fit the F mount. Now, the good news is that Nikon have also introduced an FTZ adapter that fits on the front of the camera, so you can use all of your F glass on the mirrorless cameras. One area where the Z6 Mark II does start to pull away from the D850 is the amount of focus points that it has. The D850 has 153 autofocus points, 99 of those are cross type, and it does have 3D tracking. The Z6 Mark II has a 273 selectable phase detect autofocus points. They can be used across the entirety of the frame and give you edge-to-edge autofocus points, which you don't get on the D850. For a lot of people, frames per second can be really important, so let's have a look how they stack up. On the D850, you can get 7 frames per second and 9 frames per second with the battery grip. On the Z6 Mark II, the frames per second is 14. Both of these cameras have a maximum shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. Now, the D850 can shoot in silent mode using the rear screen, but you've got to touch the screen to focus, and it's really not very good. Whereas the Z6 Mark II has a completely silent shutter, but you can use it through the viewfinder and it really works well. For some people, the video capabilities of their camera is just as important as the stills, and again, this is where the Z6 Mark II really pulls ahead. On paper, the specs are very similar. They can both shoot 4K, they can both shoot 1080p at 100 frames per second, But the big difference between these two cameras when using video is the autofocus. In the D850, the autofocus is almost useless. It's really not reliable at all. Whereas in the Z6 Mark II, if you're taking video, the autofocus is really good. The face detect is spot on. It will track you all the way around the frame. It recognizes faces, it recognizes eyes, and it's really, really good. Also, what's really useful is the Z6 Mark II as in-body 5-axis stabilization, which is really useful when you're taking that video. One of the most obvious differences between the two cameras is that the mirrorless camera, as the name suggests, doesn't have a mirror. And so what this means is instead of an optical viewfinder like you get in the D850, you get an electronic viewfinder. Now, people who've had an SLR for a long while will find moving over a little bit different, but it's not really as much of a change as you might think. Yes, the optical viewfinder is bright and you see what you see with your eye, but the electronic viewfinder offers lots of advantages. One, you get to see what the exposure is going to look like straight away in the viewfinder. You can do things like overlaying histograms within the viewfinder. You can play back the picture to look at it afterwards, and especially useful is at night time you can see what the camera sees through the viewfinder as well. So there's lots of advantages to the optical viewfinder. Both of the touchscreens on the back of the camera are almost the same. They articulate in the same way, so you can flip it up so you can look down on the camera, or you can flip it back so you can look up at the camera. Both of the screens are 3.2 inches. The only difference is that there are 2.36 million dots on the D850, whereas there's 2.1 million dots on the Z6 Mark II. But really, to the layman, you would not notice a difference at all. One thing just to bring up is that the D850 does have back illuminated buttons. So all of the buttons on the back, if you're using them in the dark, you can see them because they light up, whereas the Z6 Mark II doesn't do that. However, there are a lot less buttons on the back of this camera, and a lot of the functions go into menus that you can access through the EVF anyway. So that kind of negates that problem. Now, another quite significant difference between these two cameras is the weight. So I've taken the specs off the Nikon website of the body alone, and there's quite a big difference between the D850 and the Z6 Mark II. The D850 weighs in at 915 grams, whereas the Z6 Mark II weighs in at 615. That reduction in weight is really noticeable, especially when you put a lens on the front. Some people might ask, well, does the Z6 Mark II feel small in your hand because of all that reduction in weight? And the answer is no. The grip is still quite chunky, it feels comfortable, and when I've picked up the D850 this morning after quite a few weeks, it feels huge in comparison. Now, you might want that in a camera, but some people like that slightly more compact feel and really, really will appreciate the reduction in weight. We're in the final stretch now of comparing these two cameras. Let's have a look at the card slots that they have. Both cameras have 2 slots, one XQD slot and one SD slot. Battery life is a real big issue, especially for a mirrorless camera that uses battery much more quickly because it's now got an EVF instead of an optical viewfinder. The D850 takes an EN-EL15A battery, or with the battery grip an EN-EL18A. Now that obviously does cost a lot more because you have to buy the different battery and you have to buy a grip as well. The Z6 Mark II uses an EN-EL15C battery that has a higher capacity, and if you add the grip, then you can put 2 of those batteries in, and so the benefit is the grip takes EN-EL15C batteries and you don't need a different battery to go with the grip. So the final difference is, what are you going to have to pay for these two cameras? Now, the D850 at the moment you can still buy new, and I've looked up the price, and at the moment it costs £2,499. The Z6 Mark II at this moment in time, with the adapter, because let's face it, you're going to want to buy the adapter so you can still use all of your f-glass, that costs £2,139, and so that's quite a lot cheaper. Obviously the Z7, which is more comparable, is more expensive. So there we have it, a comparison of the specs between these two cameras. I'm not going to tell you which one to buy. There's people out there much more qualified to do that than I am, but hopefully that's given you some idea that these two cameras are very, very similar. As I said at the beginning of the video, the Nikon D850 is probably one of the best DSLRs that has ever been made and will give you excellent still shots. The Z6ii not only takes good stills, but really starts to outshine the D850 when it comes to taking video. Hope you found that video useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you with my final opinion on which one of these I would actually buy. If I hadn't got either of them and I was thinking about which one I would buy today, I would go for the Z6 Mark II. Basically because of everything that the mirrorless system offers, the lighter weight, the EVF, the video capabilities. There are so many more advantages to the mirrorless system over the D850. Don't get me wrong, this is still an absolutely cracking camera, and if you've got this and are finding it useful, then stick with it. But I have found lots of benefits to the Z6 Mark II. You can check out my Instagram, that's at Oakden Photography. There you can see lots of my images. You can also message me there and down below in the comments. Go ahead and click like, subscribe and the bell notifications. That really helps my channel. Watch out for next week's video. That goes live at 4 o'clock on Sunday. But all that's left now is to say, stay safe and I'll see you soon. One of the biggest, to speed of 1/8000th of a, you won't be disappointed with the Z. We don't say Z in this country. One of the biggest differences between the two cameras is, I'm going to start this again.